Thank you so much for having me, and just for your patience, I of course went to the Christ the King that's near Rice University first. I did pick up a partner along the way who made the same mistake, and he drove me right over here as fast as he could, and we have a wonderful person. We were joking that maybe our leader will give jokes and testimony before, and indeed he did as I was walking in, so thank you for that. Just thank you for your patience and your grace to me right now. As a sociologist for the past 15 years, I have been studying what scientists think about religion and what religious people think about science. As part of my work, my jam, my team and I at Rice University have surveyed nearly 40,000 scientists and completed over 1,000 in-depth interviews with them in their offices and laboratories about what they think about faith. And I've also surveyed more than 30,000 members of the American public, including evangelical Christians, Muslims, Presbyterians, and Lutherans, and those from many traditions, as well as those who have no religion at all about the topic of what they think about science. But I wrote Why Science and Faith Need Each Other, 8 shared values that move us beyond fear, specifically for a Christian community, for my community. And I want to talk tonight about 3 key insights and 4 of the shared values between science and faith, and I hope that will whet your appetite to read about the 4 other values of the 8. Here's the first key insight. When it comes to science and faith, there is a fine line between fear and anger. When it comes to science and faith, and I would say many controversial issues, there is a fine line between fear and anger. Here's the time when I can remember in my adult life being the most afraid. My daughter was 3 years old and I was picking her up from daycare. That day I was tired from work and parenting solo. She begged to stay a few more minutes to play with her friends, and I acquiesced. They started a game of hide and seek, and I turned away for a minute to talk with another parent. Daylight was starting to fade away. I expected that at any moment she would sidle up to me and grab my leg and wrap her arms around me. After a few minutes, when that didn't happen, I started to look around, and it's time to go, I called out. No response, and one by one, the parents and the children got into their cars and drove away. I called again, I picked up my bag, I walked over to where she and her friends had been playing, and I didn't see anyone. Where are you? My heart's starting to race, the kind of physical manifestation of panic, and I know anyone who's lost a child gets what that is like. I checked up and down the street. By then, I had lost all decorum. I started actually opening cars on the street because I thought as a 3-year-old she might actually have tried to crawl into a car in this game of hide and seek. A man came out of the house and actually said, "Ma'am, are you trying to break into my car?" I had tears at that point streaming down my face, and I actually enlisted him in the search and told him a description of my daughter and told him to go start looking up and down the street for her. After 10 minutes, the director of our daycare center pulled me aside and said that she had called the missing child alert and had activated their safety protocol, that the police would be there in 5 minutes, that we were going to do a full-on search because a 3-year-old missing for 15 minutes was too long, and that was what we needed to start. In that moment, I actually believed that I might not find her. I felt a kind of fear like I had never felt before. Then I noticed a little boy standing beside me, and he says, "She's over there in the bushes. I heard her breathing." The bottom line is, for this entire 15 minutes, where I was increasingly feeling terrorized, my daughter had been 10 feet from me. She had been hiding and trying to hold her breath so no one could hear her breathing. She heard the director calling. She heard my friend calling. She heard everyone who I had enlisted in the search, all of us calling, and yet she had chosen not to answer. I hugged her so tight to me, she actually asked me to loosen my grip. She and I both still remember this. And then, people view science and scientists and how scientists view religion and religious people. Fear can often masquerade as anger, leading to conflict. And we see conflict between faith communities and scientific communities. We should examine whether there might be underlying fears and what those fears are and try to understand them. My second key insight is this, that sociologists like me who study group behaviors, I think, bring something special to understanding the intersection between faith and science. I'm interested not just in the ideas and how they relate to one another up here, but I'm also interested in how groups have an impact on individuals and how groups can bring changes to society. One way we study this is by listening to people's life stories and analyzing to what extent these stories represent the groups individuals are part of, so what's typical. In doing so, sociological data allows us to get past the loudest and most combative voices to get a more nuanced and accurate picture of what people think, what they value, and what they believe. Sociology doesn't have the same tools as philosophy or theology. It can't really tell us the right way to live. But if we know how we want our communities or our churches or our laboratories to be different, then sociology can help us change group cultures and engage in practices that help us affect change towards those higher ideals. When it comes to examining faith and science, sociology, the kind of work that our team does at Rice, provides, I think, some key insights. Science and religion are not just sets of ideas and thought systems, although they are those things. They are also communities of people. Communities like labs, communities like here, like this church, and universities and denominations. And some people are part of both communities. And here's another insight, that science and faith, I would argue, as communities, share some core values that could bring these communities together if they're recognized and activated, if these core values are activated, to work together for the common good. And boy, do we need that, right? The last years in the midst of the pandemic and all that has happened, we really need all that we have scientifically, medically, now and into the future to heal the collateral damage of the pandemic, damage that is having and has had a really inequitable impact on particular groups and communities. This is going to require, as our societies continue to heal over time, both faith and scientific communities really working together at top capacity. I want to turn now to discussing a few of the values out of the 8 discussed in my book, Why Science and Faith Meet Each Other. The first value is curiosity. You remember some conversations for the rest of your life. I interviewed Jill, who was in my first study of how scientists view religion, about 15 years ago now. She was already at the top of her field when I interviewed her, a biologist working in a successful laboratory at an elite research university that shall remain nameless. Actually, it's Harvard. One of the only women in her institution at her level, one of the less than 10% of women in her field of science. As I walked toward her door, I noticed the door had a sign of the Darwin fish eating the Christian fish, the ichthus symbol. I was conducting my first study of how scientists view faith and ethics, and the sign made me a little bit nervous. I had some stereotypes immediately in my mind about Jill and who Jill was. As I knocked tentatively, I started to think that it would be okay. Maybe she didn't come to the door, she'd forgotten, but she came to the door right away. She did nothing to put me at ease. She didn't greet me with a handshake or a smile. She just sort of asked me to come in and told me to sit down in a metal chair across the desk from her. I can't remember now if the air conditioning in the office was on or I just kind of felt cold. There wasn't really a warmth about her. My first question to Jill was this. It was something that could have been answered yes or no. I asked her if she considered herself a person of faith, if she'd been raised in a faith background, and she said, no, I'm simply an atheist. my team and I have interviewed over 2,000 scientists about their views on faith, and Jill is still one of the only ones who cried. As her tears welled up, my own feelings also changed. They turned from this kind of intense stereotypes that I had about who she was as an atheist scientist to a sense of compassion. I also became curious about why the question about her faith background elicited such a sense of strong emotion. Jill told me that she came from a Christian family and as a child had spent a lot of time in church. She was raised in a rural community, and she also spent a lot of time outdoors, and she began to really see the beauty in nature, and she loved the natural world. She said, I would just lay down on the ground and look up at the sky and just be thankful. She also spent a lot of time in her schoolwork too. She particularly loved her biology and chemistry classes. She was a total geek, she said, and her grades were fantabulous, her word, not mine. As she became more curious about the natural world, like many of us, Jill also became interested in certain aspects of her faith. She brought questions about the origin and development of life on earth and the role of God in creation to her parents and to her pastors. At that point, Jill didn't know that she would go into science. She was simply an inquisitive kid, following and feeding her natural curiosity. But she told me when I asked hard questions, I was told by my pastor just to make a decision to believe, to forget about science, she said. It was an answer that didn't satisfy her. She's tried several times to talk to her youth pastors and her parents about the questions that science brought to mind. But her experiences with them were similar. She was consistently told not to be so questioning, not to explore so much. She said, I started to feel like religion was really a mechanism that was passed, a mechanism of judgment that was passed on people who were different. And she said, with the way I was wired, I felt different. By the time Jill was in her teens, she'd left her church. So how do we nurture curiosity, especially among youth in church communities and in scientific communities, quite frankly, as an antidote to fear? As a character trait, the philosopher Elias Baumgarten writes that curiosity is a disposition to want to know more about a wide variety of things. The more one has this character trait, the more one intensely will on particular occasions experience a desire or urge to investigate and to learn more about something. In our current culture, the word curious seems small and even weak. It brings to mind a child wondering what is around the corner before she takes a look. Our culture prefers seemingly stronger words like leader and expert and winner. But we need to value more highly in our societies the ability to ask questions that help us better understand both others and ourselves, and that help us to lead better lives. Let's ask different questions. When you happen upon someone you disagree with, let curiosity replace anger and fear. Ask why. I think curiosity is actually a show of strength, a yearning to push the boundaries on knowledge. Scientists like Jill are often known for their curiosity. For example, the string theorist Sylvester James Gates Jr., probably some of you know of, is the first Black American to have an endowed chair in physics at a major research university, and he's current president of the American Physical Society. He says he got used to being curious in his church and in his home as a kid. He said he often asked hard questions at an early age. He said, I remember once I asked my dad, do you remember me as a kid always asking you all kinds of questions? And my dad said, yes, you asked a lot of questions. And Gates said, well, it seemed like you have always had, Dad, an answer for everything. And his dad said, that's not really true. What you don't remember is that if I didn't have an answer, I'd tell you to just keep asking the question, to hold off, and I would go and get some resource or talk to someone who knew more than I did, and I'd come back and I'd try to give you an answer to that question, and it was kind of rinse and repeat. We do that over and over again. Even though no one in Gates' family was a scientist, they created an environment that nurtured curiosity in him. My research shows that many Christians are curious about the relationship between science and religion and how they can really integrate science with their faith. And this curiosity can be painful and stressful to many. Christian communities can become safe places for the curious, especially those who are curious about science and faith. The most valuable resource in the Christian community is those who have personal experience and accomplishment, the fellow Christians who have successfully done it before them. From these Christians, we can learn new ways of looking at the relationship between science and religion and why curiosity for science should be fostered and supported within the church. Churches need to become a place that offers the reward of nurturing and satisfying curiosity about science. The second shared value that I want to talk about a bit is humility. I have definitely been humbled. If you had asked me when I first started my research whether there are many ways of being a religious scientist, I'm a sociologist of religion, as you've heard, I would have said, of course, there are varied ways of being religious. If you had asked me, though, if there are many ways of being an atheist scientist, I would have definitely said 10 years ago, not. It's by definition, you just don't believe in God. Case closed. I was very sure I was right. But I have also learned over time to really doubt my assumptions, especially the assumptions I have about characteristics of groups. My studies of scientists over the past 15 years have shown me that there are varieties of atheism among scientists, and like a good academic, I've written a book about the topic, with David Johnson. And this is just one of the ways in which my research has really humbled and changed my previous opinion about a topic. I think humility is at its core recognizing the limitations of our own understanding, abilities, and perspectives. From a Christian standpoint, humility, in some sense, is being aware that we are not God. Christians also ought to be familiar with this theological idea of humility, and that full truth can never be known because of our human limitations and our limited ability to know the mind of God. It's not that there is no truth, but as human beings, we don't yet see things clearly, as the pastor and theologian Eugene Peterson translates in his paraphrase of the message. We're squinting in a fog, peering through a mist. On this earth, we're all constrained by our limited human knowledge. C.S. Lewis emphasized this sense of humility in relation to the facts about the physical universe is a kind of virtue, actually. He writes in Mere Christianity, but why anything comes to be there at all, and whether there is anything behind the things science observes, something of a different kind, this is not itself a scientific question. If there is a something behind, then either it will have to remain altogether unknown to man or else make itself known in some different way. Humility, especially intellectual humility, is a key scientific virtue. In the study of scientific virtues, the philosopher Robert Pennock has found that humility to evidence, defined as the willingness to abandon a preferred hypothesis when better evidence comes along, was one of the 10 most widely held values of science named by elite scientists. A few years ago, I read an article by the scientist Amanda King. In it, she describes her experiences as a graduate student many years before. And I think it shows the power of practicing humility in both faith and in scientific communities. She said she was part of a research team meeting that she expected to be very stressful since she had to present her results and she was by far the most junior person there. She said she was the only person in the room without at least one doctoral degree. I don't know who these people are who get more than one doctoral degrees, but they are out there. She said she wondered why they were treating her with such unearned respect, and she goes on to credit the sense of humility. She said, humility does not mean meekness. It doesn't mean unconditional deference. It doesn't mean not standing up for what you believe in, including when you believe in your own scientific findings. Humility rather means being open to the possibility of being wrong, being willing to consider other people's ideas and being respectful of your seniors, of your peers, and your subordinates. For my own studies and experiences in science, I too have seen that intellectual humility, and especially what I would call relational humility, embodying kindness and respect for the ideas of others, no matter their status, go hand in hand. When we recognize that we are very limited as individuals in our own understanding, I think that makes us develop a kind of empathy towards the other as well. I've also noticed that practicing humility is not always easy for scientists, myself included. Science can be an incredibly competitive environment that, as one scientist told me, often seems to chew up and spit out individuals with little regard for human dignity. Scientists often work incredibly long hours with no guarantee of payoff. Often we get so caught up in our career that we can forget the community of people that we are engaging with every day and who deserve to be treated with respect and who, in many cases, we actually have responsibility for. We can also become too concerned with institutional status and prestige. Yet, I've also found that many scientists do place great importance on this value of humility. Many of the about 20% of university scientists I have studied who are themselves practicing Christians said that part of their ethos, what they think of as important as a distinguishing factor, is caring for those they work with, those they mentor, those who are around them. It's not to say that those who don't identify as Christian don't do this. I wouldn't want to communicate it in any way, but I'm just telling you how these scientists who are Christian see themselves. These scientists said it's important to assure that those around them are treated with care and respect. They often view their coworkers and students as people who were created in the image of God, my research shows. One Christian biologist recounted how he tried to use humility to shift the organizational culture of his work environment. He wanted to make sure that there's a greater awareness that science is more than just a set of ideas and methods. It's more than just a career. It's more than that. It's a community of people, he said, who Jesus loves. Another scientist explained how her moral commitments as a Christian influence how she treats others, she said, regardless of their rank or background. And she explained that part of my ethic, my faith ethic, is to believe that all people are created equal and that everyone has the potential for good, and that makes them intrinsically valued, regardless of whether or not they act on that good. The third value I want to talk about is shalom. Shalom, the Hebrew word, comes from a root that means completeness and perfection. It is the peace, harmony, well-being, and prosperity that results from the flourishing of all creation. I want to acknowledge that it is very hard to appreciate shalom in these times. Very, very hard. I used to write a lot, different kinds of prayers and things like that. I haven't done that as much as I should lately. But I wrote one time in my journal that the pressures of being a researcher in the social sciences, whether to include applying for grants, teaching, mentoring, doing administrative work, leading large programs alongside my parenting. It's important to me to participate in my church, to volunteer. And then there's just the ordinary inundations of modern living, like deciding what kind of shampoo to get, like the level of choices that we have in our lives all the time. And it's very hard for me to get to a sense of stillness, to get to that kind of internal sense of shalom. Even myself, let alone trying to seek the peace and prosperity of the world around me, it's hard even to seek my own peace. Here's one way I try. In the morning as I walk to work, I'm very fortunate to live near enough to walk. Part of my prayer is a rendition of the phrase from Psalm 46, to be still and know that I am God. Not me. I repeat the phrase, let me be still and know that you are God, to myself as I walk to the university campus. Yet, as I walk quicker. I always think that, what would I do with those extra 2 minutes that I get from walking and riding quicker? There are all these thoughts I need to get done, the things that are in work ahead of me, things that I left undone at home. And as I get near to campus, I try to actively resist this urge. You know how you do this, like you're making lists in your mind just until you get to a post-it note to write them down. I'm famous for my lists. I want to repeat that phrase, let me be As I wait for the light in front of the campus to turn to green, I often stand on one foot and then the other. I've had foot surgery and I want to get a few balance exercises in that my physical therapist told me to do every day. I'm very easily distracted. And still, I want to repeat that phrase, let me be still. Once I'm on campus and through the beautiful entrance that's Rice University with its architecture, my walk takes me to this amazing art installation we have on campus, the Terrell Sky Space. When I remember, I stop there and look up. I think it may sound kind of pitchy, but I do find that act of looking up to the sky to be very centering. And it's here that I turn to the second part of my prayer, which is let me know that I am fully loved by God. I pray this piece of the prayer because it often feels like there are a lot of people to impress as part of my work. I'm sure many of you feel this way, or in your families, or whatever your space of impression management is. For me, there's colleagues, students, funders, reviewers, just to name a few, and this culture of academia, which can sometimes feel quite pressure-filled and competitive. I am at once preoccupied with my limits and also not aware enough of my limits. Let me know that I am fully loved, that I've been created. Someone told me, a spiritual mentor told me this once, and I really took it with me, that I've been created with everything I need to do in order to do what I need to do. Don't need to do things that other people need to do, just what I need to do. The last part of my walk takes me up several flights of stairs, and with each step I repeat this third part of my prayer, which is let me enter in to what you're doing today. When I arrive at my office at the earliest times before the sun fully rises, I'm very excited to be there. I take joy in my work. I am very, very fortunate, and I know very much that not everyone can say this, but I do feel I do meaningful work that has a higher purpose. On the not-so-good days, I fall prey to the hustle, and I skip the walk to get to work 5 minutes faster in my car. But on the better days, I remind myself that I'm participating in something bigger than myself that's already going on there. That I don't work for myself, I work for this duty beyond the self. I work from a place of community-based virtues like equality and justice, and I feel a responsibility to use my work to accomplish something meaningful, to improve social problems, and help people flourish. In my interviews with scientists who are themselves Christians, those who are part of other faith traditions, I found that many of them feel similarly about their work and their goals, sometimes drawing on the concepts of shalom and the twin concept of stewardship. But shalom cannot be pretended. We can't pretend there's peace and justice in the world when there isn't really. In its best sense, it needs to get involved in that messiness of the world, to try to mix it up with structures that are not just, to make them more just. The theologian Walter Brueggemann writes in The Prophetic Imagination, Jesus in his solidarity with the marginal ones is moved to compassion. Compassion constitutes a radical form of criticism, for it announces that the hurt is to be taken seriously, that the hurt is not to be accepted as normal and natural, but as abnormal and unacceptable condition for humanness. Thus, the compassion of Jesus is not to be understood as a personal, emotional reaction, but as a public criticism in which he dares to act upon his concern against the entire numbness of the social context. Many scientists who are persons of faith that I interviewed discussed increasing gender and race representation in science as one of their goals and one of the ways in which they're trying to pursue justice and seek peace in the scientific world. Some of these scientists specifically connect their faith to their efforts to increase opportunities for those who are underrepresented and have historically and are presently marginalized. That's an area of study, increasing diversity in science, that I'm really passionate about. When we look at the U.S. scientific community, we see that non-whites, especially Black and Hispanic Americans and U.S.-born Asian Americans, are vastly underrepresented in science. For example, Black Americans, who comprise, depending on region of the country, between 12 and 17% of the U.S. population, make up less than 1% of those who have careers in science, medicine, or technology. Women in all ethnic and racial groups are also underrepresented in much of science and medicine. Women, of course, represent a little over 50% of the U.S. population and represent less than 10% of most of those in scientific fields. Yet many people of color and women are actually overrepresented in Christian communities. Nearly 77% of Hispanic Americans see themselves as Catholic, Protestants, or evangelical Christians. I think this provides a really exciting opportunity for churches to be places that really encourage increased racial and gender representation in science, and I'm involved in quite a bit of this kind of efforts. When I interviewed pastors of Hispanic and Black congregations, our team at Rice has done some of this work both in Houston and nationally. A related problem is that Christians from underrepresented minority groups often don't hear about scientists who believe like them or see scientists who look like them. They face what they have told me is a kind of double or triple marginality, as an underrepresented racial group, in many cases an underrepresented gender group, and often an underrepresented faith group in the sciences. One Christian geneticist I met, who's one of the few Black women in her field at an elite university and was the first woman and the first Black American to become head of a major genetics program. She said during the 5 years she spent as a student at an elite research university, where she said we had literally dozens of speakers brought in for our weekly colloquium, there was only one Black speaker during that entire time of 5 years that was brought into her department's weekly seminar. For a lot of African Americans, science is a no trespassing zone, one Black pastor said. And he said, I think it would be helpful to have somebody of your own color and your own faith in science. A Hispanic pastor told me to see one of your own would give such an inspiration. Those who have been and are the most marginalized in our society often are deeply compelled ethically to fight structures and engage in efforts that demarginalize others. That's just one of the many reasons we need to diversify science. The science career can be used to care for people in the interest of justice and equality and human flourishing, to in essence seek shalom for the world and the people in it. I want to end with touching briefly on the value of gratitude, another important value for these times, and I think overlooked in these times some ways. And it's a way of addressing the fears that people have of each other right now. It's very hard to be afraid of someone you are grateful for. Through my studies and my personal experiences, this sense, as I said, of gratitude is really antithetical to anger and that deep emotion of fear which can sometimes overtake us. One pastor told me about his church. He says, what's so unique in the Black church tradition that I work in, he said, is that even given the extraordinary history of the people who attend my church, that still there is a theology rooted in gratitude rather than suspicion. It's a very different posture for addressing whatever life issues come your way, and it separates how you would approach science or a scientist, or how you would approach theological questions when you can assert that God is good, and you know that theology has already accepted that God is good. According to the writer Diana Butler-Bass, whose work I'm a fan of, she's recently written a book on gratitude, and she says, gratitude is not about stuff. Gratitude is rather the emotional and active response to the surprise of our very existence, to sensing that inner light and realizing that astonishing, sacred, social, and scientific events that brought each one of us into being, that allows us to value ourselves and to value every single person that we encounter around us, that allows us to cry out, she says, like the poets we're familiar with from the Christian tradition, I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Let me stop there. Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate being here.
You up for some questions?
Absolutely. I love questions.
So I'll just help monitor, and if we have a lot of folks, I'll try to keep
some order. But
Yeah.
Questions do you have in mind?
About this work or just anything. Yeah.
I remember you used to have an excellent lecture series at Rice University that kind of shut down because of COVID. Have you restarted that?
Religion Public Life series.
Yes, we have started doing some things. Yeah, we have. So let's chat after and make sure you're on the list to get invited.
Everyone else knows also, just like, so is there on the website, is there a way to
There is. We haven't been doing as much with that lately, but we are actually going through. So I'm now director of an institute on campus, the Boniek Institute for Religious Tolerance, and we have also brought our Religion and Public Life program, which I previously directed under the Boniek Institute, and are in the process of we've been able to raise some more funding and are expanding that as well. So there's going to be a lot coming up. So I think you'll have a lot of options if you go to our websites. Yeah.
Yeah, you looked at the issue of which cultures might be more accepting of science. There's in the U.S. be a lot of pushback, climate change, evolution, vaccinations. But I do think there are some cultures that don't seem to have as much of a problem between their religion and acceptance of science. Have you looked at that?
I have. So that's, as they say, it's a topic about which many books have been written. So it's a great set of questions, just to give you a couple of thoughts. So in the U.S., there is the most tension between faith and science among Christians and some groups of Muslims. And really people who are practice their religion more, I don't want to say it quite this way, but are in churches more, take their religion more seriously in terms of practice. It's very interesting to me. So we see that practice tendency and its connection to seeing a conflict between faith and science about some things, but not other things. So things that involve what I would call God and humans. So things about science that seem to challenge the idea of who God is as sovereign over the world, or challenge the idea of humans as uniquely created in the image of God. So there's no controversy really, I think there probably should be, about the technologies that go into making our iPhones. No controversies about the technologies that go into refrigeration. People want cures for cancer. So there's actually a very high regard for science in U.S. society across all religious groups. But evangelicals and Muslims do have concerns about evolution, about some forms of human reproductive genetic technologies. And I do think there is that really deep concern in our studies comes out that those folks who take their religion in a very serious, authoritative way as a guiding principle in their lives and practice their religion a lot are more likely to look askance at scientific issues that seem to connect to who God is and who humans are. And I don't think they're necessarily getting the kind of training in their church communities to wrestle with those things well. So it's, and scientists, sadly, I found over the years, sometimes do really fan that conflict idea, do say some things in classrooms and offhandedly dismiss religious people and religious ideas, which confirms all of the stereotypes that those religious groups have of scientists. So there are, I think, and I've spent quite a bit of time working on this topic, there are some interventions I think that would be very useful, and we've done some experimental work, and we've seen some benefit of exposing people, for example, to a scientist in their faith tradition, because that makes it feel like, oh, if one of my own is part of the scientific community, then that kind of gives me a segue to trusting others who are like them.
May I ask a follow-up on that?
Yeah, please.
So building on the value, the first one, of curiosity, what might you suggest, assuming kind of a general naivete, that a scientist should be first curious about with Christians? And reciprocally, what might Christians like here be first curious about with regard to science?
Oh, that's a great question. What a lovely question. So, scientists who are, there's just a huge variety of scientists. So I would say for scientists who, for often it's background reasons, feel antagonistic towards faith or feel like there is an inconsistency between being a scientist and being a person of faith, and in particular being a Christian of the type that in the broader society sometimes has conflict with science, ought to be curious about scientists who are able to seemingly reconcile these things. I think there is sadly not enough open discussion in the scientific community about anything personal. Families, we have interviewed scientists who are at top research universities. They know incredibly little about each other. I have a story. I was at a big 10 school in the Midwest doing interviews with scientists, and I interviewed a scientist who, I went into her office, and she was actually had like her Bible open. I was like, is this just to impress? Or like, and she's like, no, I was preparing for, she's like, I'm very involved in my Episcopal church, and I'm leading this adult education class, and I was preparing, and I interviewed her, and she said towards the end of our interview, she said, please, these are confidential, right? I wouldn't want anyone to know in my department to know that I'm actively involved in my church, so I'm very convinced here that all the scientists here are atheists. She had been in her department for 30 years. And so then I went out, and it was a high value to when you're doing these studies, they are confidential. And so I actually went out of her office, and I was going to interview a man who was 2 doors down from her, and I didn't want him to see me coming out of the office, so I walked all the way around, I cut my stomach into his office. And he very sadly had just lost his spouse, and said it was a real crisis of faith for him. He'd like to get back involved. He's a committed Catholic. He'd like to get back involved in his church to find a sense of community. And he said, I wish, I'm close friends with many people at work. I wish there was someone I could talk to about issues of faith, but I'm absolutely certain that there's no one here who has any faith commitments. So that's something of an anecdote. That didn't happen over and over. But what did happen over and over is that scientists, we had these interesting survey questions where we asked them, what proportion of people who do you think are religious in your department or in your unit or school? And they always vastly underestimated it. Because then we can match that with the proportion that did say they were religious, right? So also another question on the survey. So was that an answer to the question?
Great.
Okay, yeah. I was like, I got into my stories and I'm like, wait, what's the question? Yeah.
I'm just curious about your thoughts on gene editing. When it comes to playing God with editing genes.
Yeah, that's a lot. So thank you. So the questioner said, what are my thoughts on gene editing? So I am not a geneticist, nor do I play one on TV, but I have interviewed many people in this field, and also interviewed scientists broadly about the issues that they think raise ethical concerns. So our team has done several studies on science ethics. And gene editing is a very broad field. So you might be thinking of editing that perhaps changes the human germline or makes decisions for future generations, which most nations have very famous cases, right, locally about this, but one case in particular, most countries have outlawed this, right? We think that this is a bridge too far ethically, where we are making decisions now in the human germline that will potentially affect future generations genetically. So I don't know very much about the science of it, but I do know that scientists generally find this quite ethically problematic. And I think it would serve public science better if scientists were more honest about those ethical concerns, because the general public often thinks that scientists are not ethically reflective. So we have a lot of stereotypes about scientists in and when you think about, I teach a class on science and society at Rice University. It's called Science at Risk, Out of the Lab and Into the Society. And the images of scientists are often as like madmen, and they are men often in these images. It's going to blow up the world or something like that. So this kind of suspicion that these are not the most ethically reflective people. I don't think that's generally true typically, but this is a stereotype that the general public has. I think that does affect support for science at some level. And so I think it would be helpful to scientists if they were honest about their ethical concerns, about some of the human reproductive genetic technologies, about some of the gene editing technologies, and the possible implications, which I do find them to be ethically concerned. I think also that especially in congregations like this, that there is space for people, some of you are probably in science yourselves or do scientific work, that you can be real leaders in providing spaces of ethical reflection for these technologies. You have the kind of tools probably that would allow you to think ethically, reflectively about this, reflect in an ethical way. And this is where scientific and faith communities, I think, can really help one another, that faith communities can, under certain conditions, provide those spaces for ethical reflection about science.
I've seen 2 or 3 folks who want to ask questions. Just go for a couple, and then we should probably head on over to the fellowship hall so you can sign books.
Oh, fun. Thank you. This is great. I love question and answer is always my favorite. Yeah.
Science is really, correct me if I'm wrong, science is a discipline that follows a scientific method.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure that there's really room for a lot of ethical reflection in the discipline. Now, the scientists themselves may have various ethical positions, but is it really the job of the community, the public at large, the state, to decide what the limits are as far as where science can go?
Yeah, so you raise a good point. So science, the speaker said that science does not really have at its disposal the tools to engage in ethical reflection, and perhaps that's not the role of the scientific community. I would generally agree with you. There are, though, there is a kind of ideal about the role that institutions play, and then there's what we would call a whole field and understanding of practical ethics, in that all of us, in whatever role we have or field we are in, need to kind of have, some philosophers call this, kind of have a bootstrapping ethical approach, like we need to do ethics on a day-to-day basis, and scientists are doing ethics all the time. You're right, there's certainly, not all of them are making ethically informed policy decisions or something that governments might need to or other bodies might need to, but they are still practicing ethics on a day-to-day basis, and many of them want to have some space to think about how to do that work well. These are, learned people who often think broadly about a lot of things. And also, not all science is the same. So there are certain fields of science where a lot of different ethical issues come up all the time. And there are other fields of science where there is not as much, we all have relational ethics and how we treat people and things like that, but in terms of the actual day-to-day scientific work, it's perhaps not as ethically complicated, or there is a clearer normative stance. So you think about, civil engineers that study better ways to build bridges or something. There is an easier ethical road, perhaps, than people who are developing cutting-edge gene editing technologies. There's this sort of difference in the type of science there.
One more.
There are lots of problems with what I just said, so someone, I'm sure you're going to come up to me, but yeah. Thankfully, we don't have time. Yes.
Terry should have the last word. Sure. Dr. Satterwhite.
Thank you for the case that there's no room for critical thinking.
scientific methods going out the window. And, you know, as a infectious disease person, when you have something that's very obvious and people don't want to do it because vaccines are a particular thing, you know, I always say, I want to put this together, have different things come together with a way to solve it and make it acceptable rather than just choking the hell out of somebody.
You raise a great point. Let me see if I can paraphrase it, and then you nod, no, you're not doing it. You're not doing what I said justice, but probably. That there perhaps has been a decrease in critical thinking, and that we have scientific thinking, you said, has gone out the window in some corners, I would agree, and we're other kinds of reasons or cultures or ways of doing things are gaining prominence, you know, when science ought to be leading the way. Is that right?
So
I think, yeah, it is the case, I can say as a social scientist, that in the past 20 years, but if we look at, like, if we believe survey data, people's politics are driving their religion more than their religion is driving their politics. And that goes, I was just gave an interview about the connection between religion and science and politics. Like I gave this interview, I can't remember, it was a radio interview. And the commentator said, are people getting religion too involved in politics? And I said, no, they're getting politics too involved in religion. I really believe that. I said, you know, this is not, I'm not sent to say, this is I'm making a normative statement, this is Elaine speaking, not like my studies, but I don't think people are bringing their politics under the authority of their faith, you know, and it would be better for it if they did. And so instead, we are finding in survey research, especially recently, that people's politics predicts their religious sensibility, and it's very interesting. Like people's politics is really driving, and things are bundled together in an interesting way. So if you are, we call it and often it's people who are actually not involved in congregations. But in one of my research articles, I coined this term. I hope it's not offensive to anyone. Fox News Christians, where it is. And you could be Muslim and be a Fox News Christian. It's a very weird phenomenon where people are, if they go to a congregation, if they actually participate in a church, say, they are more likely to be moderated, that there are less people that are very extreme leftists or very extreme on the right, that there's actually, even if you identify personally as a Republican, there's a kind of moderating effect of being in community with people. I think it's like when you see people this is my hypothesis, when you see people face to face, it's just really hard to like massively demonize them or stereotype them. But people who say on our surveys, I'm just a Christian, but and aren't part of a tradition, are not actually going to a congregation, don't practice. These people who watch Fox News and say I'm just a Christian, sometimes there are even other religious traditions, but this has kind of become a political identity rather than a faith identity. It's very interesting what's happening. I don't know if that's the end of the place I want to stop.
Well, we'll invite folks to speak with you individually, and want to remind you to fill out the piece if you can and drop it into a basket on your way over to the fellowship hall. And we want to thank you mightily for a great presentation.
Oh, thank you so much.